Namaste. My name is Marshall Govindan, and my spiritual name is Satchidanada. For the past 50 years, I have been practicing Kriya Yoga, which is an ancient tradition founded by a great master in India. His name is Babaji, and he was made famous, and this Kriya Yoga was made famous by Paramahansa Yogananda in his autobiography of a yogi. The last few years I have been concentrating on publishing some literature with regards to the ancient teachings of yoga from South India in particular. For the past 25, 30 years I've also been teaching Kriya Yoga. So the cause of human suffering, according to classical yoga, which is very similar in many ways to Buddhism, is what are referred to as the kleshas. And they are, there's 5 of them. The first one is ignorance of our true identity, which manifests as egoism or identifying with what we are not. The body, the mind, the emotions, memories, fears. The second klesha, or cause of suffering, is known as egoism itself. Okay? Attachment is the third. Attachment is imagination that I will find happiness from something out there. Okay? The fourth is called aversion, which is kind of the opposite of attachment. And it is the dislike of something. It's the imagination that if something like that happens, I will suffer. And the last one is the fear of death. So the traditions of yoga, like Buddhism, their main purpose actually is to help people to overcome these sources of suffering. And it begins with, you might say, moral prescriptions, what you should do, particularly in your social relationships, to avoid things like telling lies, harming other people, being greedy. All these things tend to create more suffering. And they also encourage people to cultivate inner awareness, or beginning with calmness. Because when you're calm, then you can see things much more clearly. Okay? So the practice of yoga is really oriented towards 2 things: attenuating or weakening the causes of suffering, and achieving what's called self-realization. And self-realization is becoming established in the awareness of one's true identity, which is not a thing. It's what we call the subject, or the seer, not the seen. So in relationship to the seer, everything is an object. Not only those things out there experienced through the 5 senses, but also our emotions, our thoughts, our memories. These are all things that we can witness. So the exercises of yoga, for example, to practice postures, okay, meditation, breathing, all these have the effect of weakening the tendency to become agitated, disturbed, what we call, to become perhaps fatigued, doubtful, confused, and to cultivate what's called calmness or balance. We live in a culture today which emphasizes being an individual, being special, being better than others. A lot of competition as a result. And it emphasizes also acquiring and consuming things out there. So the yogic spiritual path actually begins when you are ready to be no one special, to experience nothing special. Because specialness, by its very nature, requires a separation, a division. And we are all fundamentally one. Right? So, to use an analogy, each of us in the egoistic state of wanting to be special is like a wave on the surface of the ocean, which emanates from the ocean and looks at the other waves and says, I'm bigger than you, or I'm more beautiful than you. So the process of yoga is a process of returning to the ocean and realizing our oneness with everything. And from that perspective, which is the perspective of awareness and consciousness, we find continuous bliss. The highest purpose of life is to attain self-realization in an integral manner. Self-realization can be defined as the permanent state of identification with your true self, which is pure consciousness, which has no beginning and no end. In most spiritual traditions, this is limited to a spiritual dimension of life. It does not include the intellectual, mental, vital, and even physical dimensions. But in the tradition to which I belong, which is a tradition from South India known as Siddhanta, the goal and the purpose is to make this an integral realization so that all 5 dimensions of our being are conscious, fully conscious of their true identity, and then can manifest their potential for perfection. As human beings, we are unique in that we have the ability to conceive of perfection, to see our own imperfections, and to devise means and apply ourselves to those means to go from imperfection to perfection. So we could say that the goal is siddhi, or perfection of our potential. The immortals do exist. Their goal was not to become immortal, however. Their goal was to completely surrender to the divine, to allow the divine to descend within them and to achieve what I call perfection, or siddhi. This first occurs in the spiritual dimension of one's being, where one realizes in an intimate manner the presence of the Lord. Not in a religious sense, but in the sense of deep love or communion. So the siddhas, or the immortals, refer to the Lord as love. They say, Ambu Shivam. Love is God. At this point, most saints look at the world, look at the condition of their mind and their body, and they say, I've had enough. I'm ready to leave. But a few decide to surrender at the level of the intellect, where there may be some tendency to hold on to intellectual beliefs, religions, forms, ideas, dogma, based on the culture in which they live. So they surrender that also, and they become a sage. So they're able to know things directly through intuition, through identity with whatever it is they want to know. They don't have to read a book. They simply concentrate on the subject matter, and they become one with it by identity. A few go even further to the mental plane, where they begin to surrender, allow the divine to descend and to manifest some of the potential that we have as human beings, such as clairvoyance, clairaudience, prophecy. These are faculties which are called the subtle senses. We usually use them only during dreams at night, when our eyes are closed. We're experiencing these subtle senses, right? This is part of the mental dimension. A few even surrender even at the vital level. The vital body is the seat of desires and emotions. It's the most problematic, most troublesome part of our existence. When they're able to surrender at this level, the desires and emotions, the vital body changes its allegiance from the ego. Because the ego is always looking for small delights, ways to interrupt its existential suffering by distraction. When the vital body shifts its allegiance to that of the soul, to that of our higher consciousness, the vital body begins to manifest potential for miracles, or what we would refer to as miracles. Materialization, dematerialization, and in the rarest of cases, some siddhas have been able to surrender even at the level of the cells of their body, in which this great potential power and consciousness, the light, descends into the cells of the body, and they overcome the limitations of death and disease, and they become invulnerable. It doesn't mean that they remain forever on the physical plane, but they're no longer obliged to leave it because of disease. The siddhas would say perfection in a diseased body and a neurotic mind is not perfection. Right? So this perfection, or this, you might say, immortality may occur with a body, and they remain for a long time. Some of the siddhas have existed for even thousands of years. This has been well documented. I've written a book 30 years ago called Babaji and the 18th Siddha Kriya Yoga tradition, and this encapsulates much of the literature that we've published through our research. Some of them will then leave the body, like camphor disappearing, and some will suddenly just merge immediately without even transforming the physical body. So this I'm sure sounds quite amazing to most people in the West. But if you go to South India and you talk to just about anybody, they will refer to these individuals as siddhas. And they are legendary. And they are known to be the, might say, progenitors or founders of their culture. And they, rather than leave the world, their goal, to go to some heaven, for example, their goal was to bring a divine consciousness and perfection into the world. So they worked in all fields of human interest, from medicine and the various sciences and health. Well, we have been told by the founder of the Kriya Yoga tradition, whose name is Babaji Nagaraj, he told us that he was born in the year 203 AD. Okay? His guru, Boganathar and Agastya, we don't know their exact age, but it's much older than that. I have a friend who is a monk who went to Mount Kailash about 10 years ago, and on the way, he met a number of very, very old sadhus, or holy men or monks, and one of them claimed to be 650 years old. And he inquired from him, how is it possible? How could I attain that age? And his reply was quite interesting. He said, you don't want to know. So I want to emphasize that immortality is not the goal. Complete surrender is the goal of the siddhas. Complete surrender to the divine, to descend within us, to overcome all of our egoistic limitations in all five bodies, and to attain the potential we have for perfection. There are only two traditions in the world, spiritual traditions, which emphasize and have as their goal to remain in the physical world as long as possible. This is the Taoist tradition of China and the South Indian tradition of the siddhas. Most people are familiar with Taoism. When I went to China with my teacher in 1985, we were amazed to see that all the pictures of Mao Zedong had been removed. And in his place, they had pictures of the 8 Chinese immortals. In the shops and the stores, most of them considered it to be a sort of a good luck kind of image to keep in their stores and homes. The Taoist tradition of China and the South Indian tradition share many similarities, not only in their beliefs, but also in their practices, which emphasize breathing and kundalini and the principle that energy follows consciousness and consciousness follows energy. Now, the goal is not immortality, The goal is to reach our potential perfection. And so for that, we need to have a longer life. As George Bernard Shaw once said, youth is too precious to be wasted on youth. By the time you reach maturity, or even old age, and you become wise as to the, you might say, life, by then your physical body is worn out, and you find it difficult to even practice spiritual meditation or postures or any other exercise. So if you can keep the physical body healthy for a long time, you buy time to complete the process. So this is why there's an emphasis on longevity, to have more time to complete the process of removing the manifestations of egoism, the resistance in our human nature to its perfection. This is the great challenge of our human nature. We are a work in progress. We're like a car manufactured by General Motors, which has 500 defects. Most spiritual traditions say, I can't be bothered with it. Let me out of this place. Let me go to heaven. But the traditions of China and South India say, no, we're going to overcome these limitations. We're going to manifest our potential perfection. So they use even herbs, what's called kaya kalpa, to buy more time to maintain the physical body in a healthy state. Well, I think I've made a few steps. Physically, I feel the same as I did when I was young. So I've been able to maintain my health, and I have overcome quite a few of the bad habits, and certainly the delusion of the mind. And I've certainly been able to experience self-realization, and do experience it most of the time. So, as Patanjali says, this process is not a straight line. It's more like a zigzag. We can say that there is a cultivation of calmness and the witness state, and then the realization I'm not the doer, and then the realization of Satchidananda, which means absolute being, consciousness, and bliss. So these are all things which I have been able to maintain. And I'm in the process now of continuing in this, establishing it. Physical immortality is a byproduct of one's surrender. Surrender of the perspective of I'm the body, I'm the mind, I'm the emotions, I'm all my desires, I'm my little life story. This egoistic perspective can be described in an analogous manner as someone who's sitting too close to the television program and becoming absorbed in it, so absorbed that we forget who we are. As your consciousness expands, you begin to realize that you're not the drama of your life, that you're an observer of it, and that the drama of your life is really based upon the consequences of your past. Your actions, your thoughts, what you've said, choices you've made. Collectively, all these habits are called your karma. And we're also subject to what's called the delusion, or Maya, which has 5 agents, including time. We all feel limited by time, for example, right? We feel pressed by time, right? We're stressed even. We're also subject to partial knowledge. We know perhaps a lot about a little, but we know very little about most things. So we're limited by our knowledge. We're also limited by our power to get things, to accomplish things. We're limited by our desires. Our desires keep yanking us around. And we're limited by the consequences of our past, our karma. We're also limited by our human nature, its tendency to become agitated, dispersed, to become lazy, fatigued, confused, doubtful. And even when we find moments of calmness and balance, it's very fragile. It doesn't take much to disturb us. So our challenge with our human nature is to overcome the things which surround, you might say, our light body or our soul, okay? And that pure awareness which is always there. As we surrender to this higher consciousness, as our perspective changes, we're able to, one by one, begin to overcome these limitations. And as I've said earlier, the vital body, the seat of our emotions and desires, once it begins to change its allegiance, once you become enthusiastic about this process of overcoming pride, desire, egoism, fear, anger, your higher self begins to direct your practice. It begins to point out to you what you need to change, what you need to purify still. And so you say, well, my body is wearing out. I need more time. So you do exercises, you watch your diet, you take care of your health so that you can buy more time for this process. And of course, if you have an accident or you die from illness, the aspiration of the Siddha tradition and the Chinese Taoist tradition is not simply to go to some heaven. You may be looking forward to some respite from this life with all of its challenges, but eventually you know you'll have to come back. So there is the aspiration to come back in a situation where from an early age you can continue the process of becoming enlightened in an integral manner at all levels, not simply to remain out of this world, but to bring the divine into the world fully conscious with all of your human potential for perfection. The Siddhas experimented with technology, with techniques. Classical yoga was based upon realization that there is the seer and the seen, the subject and the object. And the object of our lives are distracting. So there's a tendency in classical yoga, which is defined by Patanjali, to remain apart from the world and to simply concentrate on meditation, concentration, going within, and keeping one separate from the world. The Tantric tradition developed subsequently with the realization that the divine is everywhere. And the word Tantra actually means web, and it's referring to that web between the material world and the spiritual world. So it's the web of means that we can use to maintain a spiritual awareness in the midst of all of our activities. So rather than saying God is not in this, God is not in this, God is not in this, the Tantrics say God is in this, God is in this, God is in this, God is in this. Both approaches are equally valid, both approaches are equally powerful, but in a modern materialistic world, the latter makes more sense because the culture, and we're all habituated to value material things. We need to find a way to bring our spiritual consciousness into our work, our play, our relationships. So the Tantric approach is what I think is most attractive to people and the best approach. And we find Tantra in India, China, and Tibet. Babaji's Kriya Yoga, which is what I practice, is a distillation of the teachings of Siddhanta, the teachings of the Siddhas. And it emphasizes a fivefold path, which includes asanas, postures for the physical body to create a firm, healthy foundation which maintains your calm perspective, right, without distraction from the physical body. The practice of the breathing techniques of Kriya Kundalini Pranayama, Kundalini being your potential power in consciousness, to awaken the chakras, these psycho-energetic centers corresponding to the various psychological states that we can, each of us, manifest. Meditation, the scientific art of mastering the mind, mantras, the repetition of silently of sound vehicles to awaken the intellect and intuition, and bhakti yoga, yoga of love and devotion. The most potential practice in Babaji's Kriya Yoga is Kriya Kundalini Pranayam and related techniques, because it follows the principle that of Tantra that consciousness follows energy and energy follows consciousness. Basically, what we're trying to do in this practice is to bring more and more energy into the higher chakras. They're a little bit like the channels on your television. They're invisible, you can't see them, but you know that if you change the channel, you get a different experience. Most of us are living in the first three chakras, which are related to our need for security, our sexuality, and all our desires. Occasionally, we experience the manifestation of the heart chakra, where we feel that the needs of others are as important as our own. Even more rarely do people open up the throat chakra, where they experience a flood of inspiration and creativity. So it fluctuates, it opens and closes. So the goal of Babaji's Kriya Yoga and practice of Kriya Kundalini Pranayam is to raise the energy to open up these chakras so they remain consistently open. When your heart chakra is open, it's no longer me, myself, and I who's directing your life. It's your heart. It's your compassion and love for others. When the throat chakra opens, you are inspired and creative in all that you do. When the third eye chakra, the Ajna chakra, opens, you experience intuition and guidance from a higher source of intelligence, what Sri Aurobindo refers to as the psychic being, the voice of your soul, which begins to guide you in your life. And when the crown chakra opens, you begin to experience the presence of the awareness of the divine. Occasionally it may open in a spiritual experience and people say, I had this experience and it was wonderful, how can I get that again? If you practice Kriya Kundalini Pranayam and raise the energy up to these higher chakras, you can blow open the door and you can have access to that awareness of the presence of the divine everywhere, anytime you wish. So your challenge then is to bring that awareness into the other dimensions of your life. And this is all about balance. It's all about cultivating presence and awareness and calmness. So Kriya Kundalini Pranayam is the most potential practice that we do. And we find other traditions tend to ignore the practice of these this particular type of breathing exercise. There is a famous quotation, a famous verse in one of the most important works of the Siddha literature. It's called the Tirumandiram. Its author is Siddha, whose name is Tirumular. And in this verse he says, at first I despised the body. And then I learned to see that it was the temple of God. And I learned to take infinite care of it. This comes, of course, from the fact that, as in most spiritual traditions, the physical body can become a source of distraction with its desires, its physical discomfort, its habitual tendencies. It gets tired, it gets dispersed, it gets nervous. So traditionally, the approach of spiritual traditions is to starve the physical body of the food which will feed its desires, right? And that's why you have people living in monasteries. There's absolutely nothing that will feed their desires. In the tantric tradition, we realized, however, that the physical body is our vehicle in this world. And we want to keep it healthy and balanced so that we can perfect our human nature and its potential. Where does the divine not exist? The Siddhas would say, God exists in you as you. He manifests through his 5 functions of creation, preservation, dissolution, concealment, and grace. Not just at a cosmic level or a universal level, but also each of us, we are creating things. Our lives have been created, and every moment of our life we are creating things. There's preservation, and we preserve certain relationships. We preserve certain attitudes, philosophies, principles that we want to maintain, physical things around us. We dissolve things. We dissolve relationships. We dissolve things that we're attached to, right? Our lives also dissolve. Things happen to us, you know. It's not even done consciously. It just happens to us because of our karma, our consequences. We also experience concealment. We become doubtful, confused, angry, full of desires, right? So this concealment is really one of the most grace-filled things that we have, because it forces us to seek, to go further, to not be satisfied with the limited, you might say, delights that we've had in the past. And finally, the last is grace, when we actually have some aha moments, when we get some understanding, when we acquire some wisdom. It's like the sun comes out, and the obscurity, the clouds of concealment are temporarily suspended. So these things are happening within all of us all the time. And the Lord is experiencing and manifesting through everything all of these 5 functions. He does it on a cosmic level, universal level. We do it on an individual level. The Siddhas refused to limit God with a definition. A God defined is a God confined, said Swami Ramatirtha. There are some attributes which they have attributed, and the most famous ones are Satchidananda, absolute being, absolute consciousness, absolute bliss. Most religions become organizations and then institutions with a human nature's need to organize and control. And one of the best ways, easiest ways to control people, to maintain power and fulfill the needs of the institution, is to create fear. When people are illiterate, they can only really understand stories, verbal stories that are easy to remember. And these stories are best often expressed by personifying truths. So in all religions we have stories, and evil is personified as a devil or a demon. But these are simply personifications of the sources of suffering which we have in our human nature. And as I've said earlier, these are 5. Ignorance of our true identity, which is the mother of all the others. Egoism, the habit of identifying with the body, the mind, the emotions, the desires, the fears. Attachment, imagining and holding on to and clinging to pleasure. Aversion, holding on to, clinging to aversions or attachments to things we don't like. And fear of death. So the process of freeing ourselves from the personification of evil, the devil, is really the process of freeing ourselves from the perspective of egoism and replacing it with the perspective of the witness, pure consciousness. Yogis see the world as a play of forces which are moving through all of us, sort of like the weather. Because of our egoistic perspective, we tend to say, I'm angry, or I'm fearful, my life is miserable. Okay? But actually, these are just forces which are moving through us. And we can all add to the forces of love, forgiveness, bliss, or we can add to the forces of anger, fear, and desire. So which side do you want to be on? You have these forces working within yourself, so begin by working on yourself. That's the best thing you can do, help others. The light body is the experience which occurs when you become aware of what is aware. This is referred to as samadhi in yoga, or cognitive absorption, as samadhi is translated in the translation of the Yoga Sutras, which I've made. That is, most of the time there's a subject and an object, and the object is something out there that we experience through the five senses, or it could be an emotion, or it could be a desire or a memory. But can you turn your eyeballs around, in a sense, and concentrate on what is actually seeing? What is the seer? To become aware of the seer, consciousness itself. When you do, then you realize, oh, it's light. Okay? You experience it as light, and that's how it's often. There's a saying in the spiritual traditions of yoga: those who know samadhi don't talk about it, and those who don't know it talk about it, because the more you talk about it, the further from it you go. Words are like teacups trying to measure the ocean. So when you try to measure the ocean, of course you can't do that, and you only come up with sort of like you're pointing to something. Right? So light is something we typically ignore. We go into a room and we're fascinated by the objects in the room or the people that are there, and those things are always moving and changing. Right? But what's always there is the light. Okay? It's timeless, it's universal, and so that's an indication also as to who we truly are. This consciousness which is within, which we can become conscious of in self-realization. Some will refer to it as the soul, but in a theological sense, the meaning of the soul is various, depending on the religion. But all spiritual traditions and all religions have described or referred to the experience of it as light. The light body is also characterized as presence or being and blissful. In the yogic tradition, we talk about the five bodies: the physical body, which needs food to sustain itself; the vital body, which is obviously missing in a cadaver. Right? It animates us. It's what we feel when we have emotions or desires. The mental body, which is what we experience through the five senses: memories, visualization. The intellectual body, when we are talking, communicating, projecting ideas. And the spiritual body, which is standing back as a witness, watching all the others manifesting. What happens after death depends on what happens during the moments and minutes and hours before you die. The most important moments of your life are the last ones, because it's only the physical body that drops immediately. You will continue to have the same emotions and thoughts after it drops. The vital body will maintain itself for some time, depending upon whether or not how depleted it is. For example, if you have an accident, you're 25 years old, car accident, and you're suddenly thrown out of your physical body, your vital body has probably most of its energy. Whereas if you're 85 years old, the gas tank is pretty low. This is why when there's an accident, people, and there's been surveys, family members experience their departed loved one during the days that follow. They have some sort of a vision or a communication or some sort of a touch, because the vital body is still around, trying to make contact with them. The mental body maintains itself a little longer, and same with the intellectual body. If you leave with fear, you will attract the experience, like a nightmare, of fearful things. If you leave this world with the expectation or the hope to reunite with loved ones, or with the Jesus or Buddha or whoever you admire as your spiritual guide or progenitor, you will go to a place where that can be experienced for some time. But these experiences will, of course, compete with all your other things. So, for example, if you were attached to your car and your bank balance and your work, you'll also be drawn to revisit them in the afterlife. And these attachments or aversions will eventually draw you back into incarnation. How long depends on how strong is the attachment and the aversion. If you have purified yourself of the desires and the aversions and the attachments and the aversions, and you make a conscious exit from this world, you can go directly to the source, to bypass what's called the astral plane. What Jesus said, in referring to, he said, "In my house are many mansions. I go to prepare a place for you." But you can bypass the astral plane and go to the causal plane, which is where love, peace, truth, beauty emanate from, okay, in a pure, wholesome, integral way. Even there, at some point, you may come back to complete a process of perfection in this human world. You cannot make progress after you leave the life. You can only make progress, according to yoga, in overcoming the limitations of your soul, which we have described, in physical incarnation. Right? You still have things to do to come back to in this world, to overcome the limitations of egoism, attachment, aversion, and fear. We forget, as humans, who we truly are when we come into incarnation. Consciousness, which is like the ocean, individuates as waves on the surface of the ocean. So also consciousness, which is universal, individuates in every living thing. We call this force of individuation egoism. It's not a bad thing. In fact, if we didn't have it, we would not survive very long. But it takes an exaggerated role in our life. It's a force of contraction of consciousness around things that we need to experience to keep our life going or to fulfill certain limited desires. Yoga and spiritual practices have the opposite effect. They expand our consciousness so that we can use egoism when we need it to keep ourselves healthy and to protect ourselves from danger. But as you cultivate more and more the presence of mindfulness and the witness, then you become more an observer. And you see, even at some point, that you are not the doer, that everything is being accomplished, and you are simply an instrument of a higher consciousness.